Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we're covering Captain America, the First Avenger, which came out in 2011. It was directed by Joe Johnston, written by Christopher Marcus and Stephen McFeely, and it's the story of how Steve Rogers became Captain America at the outset of World War II. Mart, what are your impressions of this movie?
I love this movie. I'm a really big Marvel fan, so I've seen this movie quite a few times, but I'd never looked at it through a World War II lens before. But I have to say, even with that lens on, I quite like it because none of it is actually real, but it's based in sort of this World War II vibe that I like. So I really enjoyed this movie. How about you?
Yeah, I really enjoy it as well. It's the fifth film in the MCU, and I would argue that the Cap trilogy is maybe the best trilogy in the MCU. I mean, I'm sure there's people who disagree with me on that, but I like this movie. I think it's a good start to the trilogy. And like you said, I enjoy that it's sort of an action movie, a superhero movie set in the context of World War II. We'll get into it a bit more, obviously, but overall, I think it's a fun watching experience.
I agree very much. So let's get into the movie then. The movie opens with a couple of scientists discovering a frozen plane buried in the Arctic ice. And we don't know what year it is, but they go inside this cavern of ice and they find something interesting looking is what I'll say about this. Because we don't know what we're looking at yet. And then
something big, and it seems like it's probably the present day, even though I don't think they specify.
So we then flash back to 1942. We meet our main antagonist, Johann Schmidt, played by Hugo Weaving, who is a Nazi officer very clearly. He steals the Tesseract, which is a mystical object, somewhere in Norway, and there's a keeper, and he's warned by this keeper that he doesn't understand what he's getting himself into, but you get a sense that Johann Schmidt already knows what he's getting himself into.
Yeah, I put it in the notes as we get a hint that he has already fucked around and found out in some regard.
Yeah.
My favorite part of this scene was that they start out speaking Norwegian, which you and I discussed offline, but the English version of this movie doesn't tell you what they're saying in Norwegian. It just says, the subtitles just say, speaks Norwegian. And then almost immediately they switch to speaking in English with accents, which really cracks me up. This is such an American thing to do in a movie.
Yeah, like in the Dutch subtitles, you do get what they actually say in Norwegian. But later on, when there's a French speaking dude, it just doesn't give me any subtitles at all. So the French is just French with no subtitles.
Yeah, mine said in brackets, speaking French. And it cracked me up, especially because I think the French character only speaks twice. And the first time he says a few lines, but the second time, all he says is maintenant, which means now. And it says French. I was like, Disney, it would have been so easy to just put what that means.
But yeah, so they do speak Norwegian, and then the town gets destroyed by the Nazis.
Yeah, I rabbit holed a little bit because I didn't know very much about Norway in World War II. So maybe I'll just tell you some of what I learned. So in 1939, Norway was offered and turned down a non-aggression pact with Germany because they feared it would be negatively viewed by the British. Norway, if you look at it on a map, it has this super long North Sea facing coastline. And by landing on that coastline and going through Norway, you could easily access these really crucial Swedish iron ore mines. Every army fighting in this needed access to mines and minerals. And so in order to protect its sovereignty and maintain its neutrality, it had to build up its army because it was well aware that it had strategic value to both sides. And so the British had actually planned an invasion of Norway, but Germany got there first in April of 1940. And the British and French landed to help the Norwegian army put up a fight. But anyone who knows anything about World War II knows that around this time, the Germans were coming alarmingly close to winning the battle in France. And so the British and French ended up evacuating, pulling out so they could try to prevent that from happening. Yeah, so when the Allies evacuated, the Germans took over. The Norwegian king and part of his government managed to get out, and they set up a government in exile in London during the war. And there were actually 300,000 German soldiers garrisoned in Norway all the way through until VE Day in 1945, which is one German for every 8 Norwegians, which is quite a
Wow,
lot.
that's a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And as with the French, some Norwegians did escape the country and fought for the Allies, while others joined the German side and supported the puppet government. And there was also an active resistance movement. So I just, yeah, I thought that was interesting. And I also wanted to bring up, I mean, first of all, Hugo Weaving is great in this. He's such like a camp comic book villain. I mean, absolutely love him.
To quote myself, as I was talking to you yesterday, he's the greatest villain to ever have villained.
Right. He's really just leaning into that he's this Nazi who is extremely power hungry and a little bit crazy and all that stuff. So I kind of looked into this a bit more because he says this line about Hitler digging for trinkets in the desert. And there's this really interesting tie between spiritualism and the occult in the 19th century and Nazi ideas 50 years later. So basically, there was this woman who they consider to be sort of the mother of the modern New Age movement. She was a prominent spiritualist, a prominent occultist. Her name was Helena Blavatsky, and she wrote a book called The Secret Doctrine. And this book was about how she lifted a lot of these ideas whole cloth from like different Eastern cultures and all over the place. But essentially, her ideas came down to there was this secret, like real place called Atlantis. Yes, the Atlantis.
Wow.
And yeah. And so from this place called Atlantis, there was all these like races and sub races. And the race that should be in charge was called the Aryans. And the Atlanteans had given them all this knowledge and magic that they could use in order to make the world better and make progress. But unfortunately, this evil subrace split from the Aryans. And if you think you can guess whether she specifically named who that subrace was, she did, and you probably guessed correctly. So anyway, she propagated and articulated all these extremely anti-Semitic ideas about a master race. And then other people sort of picked up and ran with those ideas. And after World War I, there was actually a lot of German right-wing paramilitary groups that were, engaging with those myths and stories. And there was this sort of overarching ideological society called the Thule Society. And Hitler was never a member, but like Rudolf Hess was a member. He was the one who helped Hitler write Mein Kampf. Rosenberg was a member, and he actually wrote a book in 1930 that was basically just a retake of Blavatsky's ideas. He quoted her extensively. There was this whole book that was basically just like her book rewritten, and it was the second best-selling book in Germany after Mein Kampf. And so Nazi ideas have these really deep roots in like spiritualism and the occult. And because of that, Hitler had these archaeology projects where he would send these teams of archaeologists all over the world to try and dig up items that would support this idea that Germanic people were descended from a master race. And obviously they never found anything because it's pure nonsense. And these kinds of ideas fed into the Nazi breeding program and their eugenics programs. And all of her ideas about this progression towards a master race sort of fed into Nazism. And so I thought it was really interesting how we have this main character who's, into this mystical object that he wants to find. And he's all about that. And it sort of is like pulling from that sort of root.
What a rabbit hole to go down in, by the way. Jesus.
The journalist Robert Evans has a podcast called Behind the Bastards. The tagline is a podcast about the worst people in history. And he has a really good 4-episode series on Helena Blavatsky. And if you want to hear about her Nazi-related ideas, you can skip right to the 4th episode, and it's pretty comprehensive and fascinating and deeply weird.
Amazing. It's funny, I never would have thought a guy like Hitler to be into spiritual stuff because he looks so non-spiritual to me.
Yeah, I think it was giving these sort of obviously completely baseless, bizarre ideas about a master race like some foundation.
Yeah, maybe just to convince other people rather than himself because he was obviously already convinced.
Right, exactly.
Wow. Yeah, that's a fun opening to this fictional movie.
Yeah, I never met a rabbit hole I didn't want to go down. Well, I sort of knew about this already because I've been a longtime listener Behind the Bastards. So it sort of twigged something in my brain when I heard this line about digging for trinkets in the desert. But yeah, I feel like there's just so many like little side quests you can go on if you want to research World War II.
We finally meet Steve Rogers as he is getting rejected for the umpteenth time while trying to enlist for the army. Because he's a very scrawny, sickly man at this point. We see he has asthma and I don't know what else, but lots of other diseases. And after he gets rejected, he goes to see a movie, and before it is a little commercial for the war, a little bit of propaganda. And some guy speaks up during it, and he gets mad at this guy, which ends up with him getting his ass handed to him in the alley behind the cinema. And he gets bailed out by his best friend, Bucky Barnes, who's played by Sebastian Stan. Steve Rogers is played by Chris Evans, who is Captain America.
A very bizarre looking Chris Evans at this point in the movie because it's Chris Evans's head on this tiny body.
Yeah. I think if you think about when this movie came out and when this was made, it looks fairly realistic, but also really, really weird at the same time.
Yeah, it does look pretty good. I had looked into this a little bit, and I guess they filmed every scene 4 times. So they would do a scene where Chris Evans was in it, just his normal self. And then they would film a version where it was just him against a green screen so they could sort of lift his image out. And then they filmed a version of the scene that didn't have him in it at all, so they could plop that image from the green screen one into it. And then they would film a 4th one with his little tiny body double just in case the first method didn't work. So it's pretty intricate.
Yeah, that must have taken a lot of time. But Sebastian Stan gets to be his normal self in this movie as Bucky Barnes.
I do love that Bucky divined that Steve was somewhere getting his ass kicked. Like, how did he know Steve was down that alley?
Probably a spider sense or something with stealing.
Yeah, he's like, oh, Steve's somewhere getting his ass handed to him again.
And also in the scene, we get the famous Captain America line, I can do this all day.
Yeah, and this is also the first time that he picks up a shield when he picks up the garbage can lid.
And he does it a couple times in the movie. We'll point them out for you later. So Bucky takes Steve to go on a double date because Steve finds out that Bucky has enlisted and gets to go and he's leaving tomorrow. And they go on a little double date to Stark Expo, which, if you don't know, Stark Industries is Tony Stark's dad, Howard Stark's big exposition with all of his tech and stuff. It's like Elon Musk, but less toxic, I would say. And
a bit era specific, maybe a bit Howard Hughes-esque.
So they go to this exposition, and Bucky is trying to convince Steve to have a good time with this girl, and this girl is also obviously very not interested in him. So he wanders off, and he finds another recruitment office, which you would think he would learn after 5 times that he's not getting into the army. But here he's noticed by Dr. Abraham Erskine, who's played by the lovely Stanley Tucci, and who is very obviously German, very comic book German.
Yeah, we looked into this a bit, and they asked him why he was drawn to this role, and he said that he had always wanted to do a German accent, which I think is very funny.
Yeah, and it's a very almost caricaturistic accent too. It's very, but it's obvious. Like in a comic book movie, it works very well. Yes. And he's impressed by Steve, not because he's big and strong, but because he's persistent and he likes his motivations. So he wants him for his super soldier project or experiment that he's working on. Steve agrees.
Right before this particular bit happened is Bucky somehow also knew that Steve was trying to enlist again, because I guess he knows him that well. And then him and Steve say their goodbyes and Bucky ships out, and that's the last time we see him for a while.
But then Steve also gets to go through basic training under Colonel Chester Phillips, who's played by Tommy Lee Jones, who's a better commander than Alec Baldwin in Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, I mean, that bar is so low, it's a tavern in Hades, but you're right. I thought Tommy Lee Jones was the absolute best casting choice for this because Tommy Lee Jones looks perennially disappointed.
Yeah, he's very amusing. And we also meet British MI6 agent Peggy Carter, played by Hayley Atwell, who is very, very good looking. I love this lady. And she's a very kick-ass female character that gets to kick ass. So
yeah, I think They did a good job with her costuming and stuff too. I mean, not that I'm an expert or anything, but yeah, she looks the part. I don't know. Yeah, and I agree. It's nice to have a female character who has something to do in a World War II movie. That's
Even if
always
she's
something
made
to
up.
enjoy.
It's almost even better when she gets to do something even though she's made up, because so often they'll just be head wrecked and she really isn't one. I mean, she's a romantic interest for Steve, but she punches the guy in her first scene.
Yeah, I think
Steve,
it's maybe worth pointing out that sometimes when these mainstream movies that I mean this movie was written by men, but they'll try and write a strong female character and they in their minds think that strong has to equal strong the way like a man would perceive strength. And so, obviously we see her knock that guy out. She takes an absolutely surreally good shot when her and Steve were chasing that assassin down later. She's obviously very physically strong and competent in shooting and warfare and that kind of stuff. So I just thought it was really interesting. Yeah, I mean, she is a good female character, but she was clearly designed to be strong in this very specific way.
yeah, I guess you're right. I didn't even look at it that way yet.
Part of the reason I think why we don't see that many women in World War II movies is that people and a lot of men who write war movies might think that in order for a woman to be perceived as a strong, good female character, she has to be strong in this specific way. When in fact, we know that there were women participating in World War II in all different facets. There were women pilots, there were women spies, there were women factory workers, this and that and the other thing. And so, yeah, I wonder if that might be a reason why we don't see as many women as we might in these kinds of movies.
Meanwhile, while she is very strong, Steve really isn't, but he's very smart because he does some very clever things, like they have to take down a flag, and every idiot in this troop is trying to climb the pole to get the flag. And Steve realizes that he can just take the pin out that keeps the pole off and it just falls down and he takes the flag. Stuff like that. He just uses his head and his heart quite a lot. He also jumps on a grenade thinking it's armed when it's not. So that's where he excels.
Before we go too far past it, I just wanted to pick out the line that he says when he's being recruited, where he says, I don't want to kill anyone. I don't like bullies. I don't care where they're from. And to me, I think it's what Americans wish was true about themselves. It's kind of the least political way of putting that. I don't know. I think it's really interesting.
Now, all his non-physical achievements in his training are the reason that Erskine tells him that he wants him for the procedure. And he also tells him that Smith actually stole some of the super serum that it's used to make the super soldiers. And he used it on himself, but it had some severe side effects, which is something we already gleaned kind of in the first scene.
Where he fucked around and found out.
He tells Steve that even though his physical appearance will change, he wants him to promise to keep on being a good man. That's a very thematic thing in the entire trilogy, really, for Captain America. His sense of justice is very important.
Yeah, he's really not a character that, I guess, in some ways you can see that Iron Man is a bit more, we'll call it morally nuanced, morally gray. But Steve is this character that we're supposed to believe is always trying to do the right thing and that his heart's always in the right place.
Yeah. But there's something about the way they call these enhanced humans kind of super soldiers. Gives me heebie-jeebies a little because it's such a Ubermensch kind of word to use.
Yeah, expand on that a little.
So I think it's done on purpose, really, because obviously Hitler wanted to have the Ubermensch, and the super soldier, in a sense, is no different, except Erskine in this story says something along the lines of, this serum will enhance all the parts of you that already exist, so it'll enhance the good parts, but if you're evil, it'll make you more evil, which explains why Smith is so evil, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's just, but it still makes me, even just the word makes me kind of think crawly a little bit.
Right.
Super soldier, it just makes me ick.
Yeah, because of course, as you're saying, Hitler had these breeding programs and these eugenics programs to try and make the perfect people. They didn't even think the Germans were the perfect people. They were trying to breed a more perfect race. So yeah, I totally see what you're saying.
Yeah. That said, they do go ahead with this slightly spooky thing. But first, before it happens, we see Smith and his maybe scientist friend called Dr. Arnim Zola, played by Toby Jones. They are trying to get the Tesseract to it's an energy source, right? So they're trying to get it to use it to make really big, nasty weapons to destroy the world.
Yeah, it's a very simplistic comic book bad guy thing to want, where he's gonna bomb New York and he's gonna bomb Chicago and he's gonna bomb all these places.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of you were talking in a chat that we're both in earlier. You were talking about apocalypse movies. And it's that kind of evil that's happening here as well. The end of the world kind of evil.
Yeah, in reference to that same conversation, we were talking a bit about how the modern American state has never been through that sort of thing. Obviously, Japan went through significant bombing. Germany, Britain, France, the Netherlands, all these places where took significant property damage in World War II, which took a long time for that to be repaired. And obviously, there were a lot of civilian deaths and a huge human toll as well. And then that's never really happened in the modern American state. They haven't seen their society collapse in quite that way. And so, yeah, it's this big sort of like boogeyman, I guess, so to speak.
Yeah. And what I thought was kind of interesting about this bad guy, Smith, we'll get to it later, so it's a bit of a spoiler, but I guess it doesn't matter when I say it. He also wants to bomb Berlin. He's not like, I'm German, so I'm gonna leave Germany alone. No, he's just also gonna bomb. And I'm not actually really sure why he wants to bomb everything.
Well, also that you touch on an interesting point where at this point, we're still pretty early in the movie and we're supposed to separate Schmidt from the rest of the Nazis. He's this megalomaniacal madman and he's going to bomb everything, including his own guys. And I just thought it was kind of interesting where this movie sort of takes the Red Skull. And of course, we know that he's a Nazi, but it's not something that's really emphasized very much. And he sort of gets away from it early in the movie. I just thought that was a really interesting choice, considering Captain America was explicitly created to fight Nazis.
Yes, we haven't mentioned this yet, but the organization that he works for is called Hydra. And I think originally in the storyline, they're a science division of the Nazis or something silly like that. But he later becomes more evil than the Nazis, or at least that's what they're trying to make you think. Which I don't, and like, weren't the Nazis like a big enough evil for them to fight?
I know. They're like, not only we have these people over here causing a genocide and taking over Europe, but wait, there's more.
Yeah. So Steve undergoes the procedure and it's successful, but it's in this big underground base kind of thing. And unfortunately, there's a German spy among them who blows up the joint. And Dr. Erskine is killed, unfortunately, which makes me very sad. The spy that kills him is played by Richard Armitage, and he's sent by Smith, actually, so maybe not the Nazis, the eviler Nazis. Before all this happens, Peggy and Steve kind of talk in the car, and they're friendly, and you can see they're connecting. But Steve is this tiny guy, right? And then he undergoes this transformation, and Peggy gets to ogle him for a bit. Like, unashamedly, she can just look at him and
Yeah,
enjoy
she's
him for a
thirsting
second.
big time over Big Steve.
And I think that's funny because usually in most movies it's the men looking at women, so we're turning the tables, and it's a funny moment. To be honest, I find it very amusing. But also, Steve is now Super Steve, and this spy gets away, but Steve goes after him, and he's getting used to his body, so he's learning how to run. And it's not very graceful, but it is very funny. Unfortunately, before he gets to capture this guy, he uses a cyanide pill that's in his tooth, I think, and he dies before they can get any information from him. But also the last super serum is destroyed, which is also very important.
As we know, Steve is now, of course, going to be the only super soldier, which I I wrote in my notes, another quote unquote one special guy story in the least quote unquote one special guy war in history.
And also we get another little shield hint in this scene because he hides behind a car door and he uses it as a shield, and there's a star on it, which is a little wink at the design of the shield later. So there's lots of little Easter eggs in this movie.
Steve goes on a war bond drive and he's going all over the place doing the same show every night with these showgirls. He punches out an actor playing Hitler and they're trying to raise money. And he's in Italy and they're performing, I guess, for a group of soldiers who don't take it nearly as well as the audiences back home do. They ridicule Captain America a little bit. And that's when he learns that Bucky's unit, the 107th, was decimated by Schmidt and his forces. And Agent Carter helps him to get Howard Stark, who's played by Dominic Cooper, to fly him behind the enemy lines on a solo mission. And he breaks into the Hydra lab on this rescue mission. He lets a bunch of other guys out that are prisoners as well. And he manages to save Bucky. And they have just a funny little conversation. Steve says, "I thought you were dead." And Bucky says, "I thought you were smaller." That's what it is.
Yeah, it's a fun little quip back and forth because they're a funny pair of friends because they're constantly, especially Bucky's constantly berating him in a funny way, but it's not toxic or anything. It's just good natured.
Yeah. And I thought they did a pretty good job too of showing Bucky in the background at this point, having to adjust to this new reality where Steve is bigger and stronger than him, and that completely changes their relationship dynamic.
I also kind of wanted to touch, if you don't mind, on the war bond drive thing, and also the hilarious song that they've come up with. Because what did they call him again?
The Star Spangled Man with a Plan.
With a plan, yeah. It's such a
Oh yeah,
like
the Tommy Lee Jones line when he says, "Star Spangled Man, what is your plan?"
And also, I think it's symbolic again for America being the one with the plan and being the savior. It's very symbolic.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the war drive scenes because we don't get any good montages anymore, and this movie has two of them. One for all the times he's performing, and then he's doing like a bunch of propaganda movies as well. And you see a big montage of that. And I think that's really funny.
Yeah, and it's a good origin story for why he's wearing that absurd costume.
Very true.
So he manages to save Bucky and the other men who will become the Howling Commandos, but Schmidt manages to escape after peeling off his face and revealing himself to be Red Skull. Steve and his new team, the Howling Commandos, they decide to undertake a mission to destroy the remaining Hydra bases. At this point, the Colonel, Tommy Lee Jones's character, gets along with Steve a little better, so he's encouraging this. And Steve bails on a ceremony to give him a medal, which is where we get the classic Stan Lee cameo, where he says, "I thought he'd be taller," when this other guy comes out. Clearly not Cap. The Howling Commandos include Dum Dum Dugan, played by Neil McDonough, with just an absolutely delightful mustache. Gabe Jones, played by Derek Luke. Jim Morita, played by Kenneth Choi. James Montgomery Falsworth, played by J.J. Field. And Jacques Dernier, played by Bruno Ricci. The Howling Commandos they had their own comic book series called Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos, which was created in 1963 by Jack Kirby, who was also one of the co-creators of Cap and Stan Lee. And it followed an elite special unit, the First Attack Squad, which was stationed in a military base in England to fight missions primarily, but not exclusively, in the European theater of war in World War II. So this is where we, of course, get the origin also of the character of Nick Fury, played by Samuel L. Jackson in the Avengers movies. And he led this racially and ethnically integrated unit. And as you may be aware, racial integration was not the norm of the day in the US military in World War II. And so actually there was a little incident that happened where when they printed the first issue, Stanley had to send a memo to the color separator of the printing plant to be like, yes, the character of Gabe Jones is supposed to be black, because they had printed out the issue and colored him like he was white. And Gabe Jones was actually depicted as having started his military career in a real regiment, which was the 92nd Infantry Division, which was the only African-American infantry division that was allowed to participate in combat in Europe during World War II. And they fought in the Italian campaign, which makes sense because that's where he was captured by Hydra, because that's also where Bucky was rescued.
And we've been discussing this, but we would very much like a limited series on these guys. I mean, I don't have any ins with Marvel, but in case anyone's listening, give us some Howling Commandos, please.
Yes, I would love a Howling Commandos TV show. Do it.
There's also another funny little thing that happens during the Captain America montage is where we see kids reading a comic book of Captain America, and it's the actual first issue of Captain America as it was released in 1941.
It was December 1940, but the date on it is March 1941 because that's just how comics work.
Yeah, I thought that was a nice little touch to see, like, it's Cap punching Hitler on the front cover.
Yeah, and that's one of those things too, right? It's like Cap was explicitly created to fight Nazis. He literally punches out Hitler on the cover of the first issue. Yeah, what was I going to say? Oh, I I sort of cracked up at how when Bucky enlists and ships out and goes overseas, it's 1942, and then when he gets rescued, it's roughly 1943. And he seems real surprised to find out that Steve is Cap now. It just cracks me up because I'm like, did y'all not write to each other at all in the last year? You just were like, oh, that's my best friend. He's all I have in the world. I guess we won't speak again until he gets back.
And I guess they could have explained it by saying, like, it's confidential or something, but they didn't even do that.
It just
Weird.
cracked me up.
Howard Starr gives Steve his fancy vibranium shield. But right before that, I feel like it's worth a mention because it made me laugh. Steve is kissed by another female officer played by Natalie Dorman. He's kissed by her and he kind of goes along with it, and then Peggy sees it and gets upset about it. And then she shoots at the shield and says something like, I guess it works, or that'll do, or something. And I thought
It cracked me up.
yeah, that was funny. But then later, even though they're fighting, you see Steve in a video or something, like a reporting, and he's got a little photo of her in his compass or his pocket watch. It's very cute. And also at the same time, Smith kind of decides that he doesn't want to be a Nazi anymore. He wants to be the bigger evil. So he kills a bunch of Nazis with his special weapon. And before he kills one of them, that guy sees on a big map that he also plans to destroy Berlin. So it's like, oops.
Yeah, we're also seeing sort of his reaction to Cap and the Howling Commandos taking out all these Hydra bases, which is he's pretty pissed about it. In early 1945, the Commandos orchestrate this plan where they're going to kidnap Arnim Zola from a train. And Zola, if you'll recall, is Schmidt Brainiac behind all of his weapons technology. And they are successful in kidnapping Zola, but it comes at a cost where Bucky falls from the speeding train into a snowy canyon. And of course, Steve is very, very upset at the loss.
Yeah, and he tries to drink his sorrow away, but he can't because his metabolism is different now and he can't get drunk.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. He's trying to get drunk and taking responsibility and feeling guilt over Bucky's death. And Peggy says something like he should allow Barnes the dignity of his choice. Like he chose to come along and be involved, and that was a risk that he chose to take. And then Steve turns it around on her at the end and says something about him being allowed the dignity of his choice. I thought that was interesting.
Yes. I didn't even realize that was going on, but you're right. Yeah. So now that they've kidnapped Zola, they interrogate him, and Zola tells him where the last Hydra base is. And Steve then goes to save the day because Smith is going to bomb the world, as was his master plan. So he gets there just in time to climb into Smith's super bomber to stop him from completely destroying New York. He and Smith fight, and the container that's holding the Tesseract breaks. And then Smith tries to just take the Tesseract with his bare hands, and it destroys him and yeets him into space.
Yes.
And the Tesseract clearly has loads of energy because it burns through the plane and just falls into the ocean, and we don't see it again for a while. Also in this fight, the bomber has kind of become like Smith had put it on autopilot, and for some reason Steve can't stop it from keeping course, so he has a choice to make. He either can crash land it into the ice or the Arctic, or lots of people are gonna die, and that's his choice. And he then makes the choice to crash it into the Arctic while talking to Peggy on the radio about a date they're supposed to be having to go dancing.
Yeah, and then the radio cuts out and you just see it's just static and Peggy's crying. And
yeah, And they look for Steve, but they also look for the Tesseract, which we see Howard Stark finding. And then we see the war ending. So in the end, it wasn't Captain America that stopped the war after all.
Yeah. But
And,
it's cute. Do you see those little kids playing at being the Howling Commandos? That was really sweet.
like, once again, they have the trash can shield that Steve had in the beginning, which I think is a very nice touch. And then you think it might be over, but no, it's not, because we see Steve wake up in a hospital room and it's dressed up like it would be in the 40s, but he quickly deduces that something is wrong when a female agent comes in and he doesn't quite trust her. So he fights his way out and we find out it's a set and he runs into what would be modern day New York. And that's when Nick Fury tracks him down and he explains that he's been asleep for 70 years. And he looks kind of upset about it. And then when Fury asks him what's wrong, he says, I had a date.
It's interesting. We're talking a bit offline about this, about how in the scene he realizes that it's not the 1940s because the game that's on the radio is a game that he had been at. So he knew that that game couldn't be going on currently. But then someone else had pointed out that the agent's 1940s get up is not accurate. The tie's too wide, the hair is wrong. So there was just all these little details that.
And she had a bra, like a very visible bra. They might have chosen someone who looks like Peggy because she's got like brown hair and curls and she looks pretty similar to her to make him feel more comfortable. But that's how the movie ends. At least, if you know Marvel movies, you know it's not the end. Because we then get the credits, which are full of American war propaganda imagery. Like we get Rosie the Revelator, we get lots of I Want Yous and stuff like that in the imagery. I thought that was really funny. In the post-credit scene, we see Steve boxing up his feelings after being asleep for 70 years. And that's when Nick Fury shows up to recruit him for the Avengers, which is a whole other movie. So he gets to be in another company of heroes.
We have some topics of discussion.
Yes, we do.
So I pulled a couple of quotes because I just thought Captain America as a hero is interesting. Just sort of super briefly, because I looked into the history of the comic books. I was just curious. So at the time when he was created, obviously he was for fighting Nazis. And then after World War II, he kind of fell out of popularity. They discontinued Cap in 1950. They super briefly revived him in 1954 as Cap the Commie Smasher, and people were not into that at all. So it went away. And then he got revived for good in 1964. And that's where the whole Cap is frozen in the ice plotline comes from, where he's like a man out of time and he's always trying to adjust to the current reality. Except in the original comics, of course, he was trying to adjust to the 1960s and not the current era. But the comics, even though he came back during the Vietnam War, the comics didn't really touch on Vietnam very much. Stan Lee said something about he couldn't see any of our characters taking on a role of super patriotism in the world as it is today. So they kind of got away from that and they were focusing more on stories that were about more domestic issues rather than international issues. So like poverty, racism, pollution, political corruption. Cap introduced the Falcon as the first Black superhero in mainstream comics. And in 1974 and again in 1987, Steve even drops the moniker of Captain America completely because he's very disillusioned with the things that the US government have done in the comics. And 1974, this is sort of in the wake of Watergate, and 1987 during the Reagan era. And so all of these things, even though they are comic books, they also do kind of reflect the real world and the politics of what's going on. So I kind of had looked into that a little because I just was sort of curious about how they had taken this super patriotic superhero and placed him in the context of later eras.
It also makes you think about Stan Lee's political views, especially what he said about the Vietnam War thing. It makes you wonder if he was opposed to it.
Yeah. And I pulled a quote from Jack Kirby, who was one of the co-creators. Cap was created by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon, who were two Jewish men at the outset of World War II. So they both had very strong views about Hitler, of course, and the Nazis, but about how America should be getting involved at a time when it had not yet gotten involved. And of course, you will recognize that The first comic came out in 1940, so this was before the Americans were really involved in the war. And this quote from Jack Kirby says, "It was a time of deep passion. Hitler was grabbing all of Europe. We had Nazis in America, Nazis holding mass meetings in Madison Square Garden. Captain America was created in that atmosphere. He was a natural outgrowth of the passionate mood of the country."
Interesting. And so obviously also only a part of the country, right? Because I'm sure lots of Americans also didn't want to be involved in the war.
Well, and it's super interestingly too, after his first few years are during World War II, he was always fighting Nazis. And the Timely Comics, which was like the predecessor of Marvel, they actually had to hire security because people were sending death threats to Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. People were loitering, posting up outside the office to like threaten these guys for making this anti-Nazi superhero. So there was quite a lot of people who were not into this.
Right. It's kind of I don't know why, but I'm almost a little bit surprised that there's a comic book hero that's this anti-Nazi so specifically. Not to say that Americans aren't, because obviously they are, but still to have such a prominent character like survive over time as well, even though he went away for a while. I think that's pretty unexpected. I don't think I would have guessed he would have stayed that long in America.
Yeah, it's that's sort of, and I mean, we've talked about this before, where the World War II was the quote unquote last good war. And so he came out of this time where afterwards, obviously, American and international conflicts were like quite a bit murkier, and it was less clear about, motivations and winners and losers and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I agree. It's really interesting that he has survived as a character and been so popular, like enduringly popular.
But I did like you said something earlier in the podcast, which I think might sum up why that is. He's kind of the Americans want America to be. It's this ideal that America wants to be, whether they are or not remains to be seen. But I think that's a very good explanation for his popularity.
Yeah. I also have a quote here from one of the writers of Modern Cap. And obviously, who Cap is as a quote unquote character has changed dramatically over 80 years and dozens of writers. So, of course, there's not always consistency in the character. But one of the modern writers is Ta-Nehisi Coates. And he said, "Rogers' transformation into Captain America is underwritten by the military, but perhaps haunted by his own roots and powerlessness, he is a dissident, just as likely to be feuding with his superiors in civilian and military governance as he is to be fighting with the supervillain Red Skull. He is a quote unquote man out of time, a walking emblem of greatest generation propaganda brought to life in this splintered postmodern time." It's interesting to me to see that the modern writers of Cap are obviously like very aware of these roots, but they're also able to pull these little pieces out of the character. We talked about this a little bit online, but the whole Civil War plotline where Cap was representing the side where they didn't want to register with the government. And if we're looking at the sort of context of that plotline, it was around the time of the Patriot Act where people were talking about privacy and whether the government should be allowed to spy on you and all that kind of stuff. And Cap was decidedly against that. So yeah, I just think it's interesting how they're still placing him in these modern political contexts as well, but they're super aware of his origins.
Yeah, it's like he's simultaneously the pinnacle of myth making as well as the opposite of it. I don't think there's any other character that's like that, at least not in the Marvel comics.
We have some other like little bits and pieces of trivia here.
I liked the little tidbit about it being released from Russia, South Korea, and Ukraine as just the First Avenger.
I read about this. Apparently, Marvel gave them the choice. Everywhere they internationally released the movie, they were like, you can call it Captain America, the First Avenger, or you can just call it the First Avenger. And probably not surprisingly, Russia and South Korea and Ukraine elected to just drop the Captain America part.
I thought that was funny. And I looked up some more. In some museums in the US, they use Captain America as a way to get young kids involved in the World War II stories, which I think is really cool. If you can use a comic book hero to keep telling these stories, I think that's cool.
Yeah, well, this ties into that, and also what you were saying at the beginning about watching this through a World War II lens instead of a superhero movie lens. And when it came out, Captain America: The First Avenger was the third highest grossing motion picture set during World War II after Saving Private Ryan and Pearl Harbor. So a ton of people saw this movie. So it's definitely probably has shaded at least some of people's perceptions of World War II.
Yes. How many people do you think Hydra are just actual Nazis, or do you think they're a different kind of villain? I just think it was funny that Hydra's like outfits and stuff are very similar to like the SS. They're all black, shiny boots, very spooky Nazi imagery.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a choice to take a character who spent his first 5 years in print fighting Nazis, literal actual Nazis, and then putting him in this movie where it's just not super emphasized. You know what I mean? It's like, yeah, it's we're supposed to pick up what they're putting down and there's context clues, but it's interesting to me that they didn't want to come down too hard on the Nazi angle.
Definitely. And I do also think that it's only going to resonate with adults that they're meant to be Nazis. Like, if you're a kid, they're just evil. They're not specifically Nazis. But if you're an adult, you can definitely see the similarities. But they could have just been honest and just made them Nazis instead of Hydra.
All right, well, let's rate this movie Neil McDonough's handlebar mustaches out of 10. How many Neil McDonough's handlebar mustaches out of 10 would you rate this movie?
I find this really difficult because I really want to give it like an 8.5 because I really enjoy it. But I can't say like as as a war movie, I think it's almost merely entertainment. It doesn't have the depth or the sharpness of a World War II movie. So I think I'm still gonna give it an 8.5, but just because I enjoy it so much as a movie. And it's funny and it's got little Easter eggs in there and I enjoy all those things. So that's why it got such a high rating for me.
Yeah, we had talked about this a little offline, but I had said I was happy that they did set this movie in the 1940s because the context of Captain America is so important and intrinsic to who he is. You know, so often we see superhero movies where because of the floating nature of time in comics, it's they take a story that was written 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago and they set it in the modern era. And there's definitely ways that you can do that. But I was glad that they didn't do that with Cap. At the same time, I agree with what you're saying about how World War II is almost just feels incidental to this movie. It's World War II adjacent. It's set against the backdrop of World War II, but I agree, it doesn't feel strongly like a war movie. I mean, we've mentioned throughout this the dates when things are happening, but we're just loosely really basing this on when we think things are happening because in the movie that's really not specific. It's not like, oh, in the backdrop of storming the beaches and whatnot, then this was going on, or oh, in the backdrop of the Battle of the Bulge, Captain America was doing this. It's like, no,
No,
we don't
right.
really the war.
No, and I feel like you look at some of like Hydra's or Smith's base and it looks vaguely like Hitler's Berchtesgaden, like Alps residence a little bit. Like there's some hints here and there. And Cap mentions at some point some kind of line. I can't remember the name, but it's in France. It's like a defense line for World War One, I think. So they do try and kind of base it in this actuality of what was going on at the time. But the story itself is just completely separate from anything that's happening in World War II. So could have been any war, basically.
Yeah. So with that in mind, I did enjoy it as a comic book movie. I am going to give it a 7 Neil McDonough's handlebar mustaches out of 10. And yeah, it was a fun watch. I mean, if you if you want to kill a couple hours, you definitely want to ask for your money back. It's just not really a quote unquote war movie, I wouldn't say.
No. Like it touches on a lighter subjects as well, like on the war bonds and stuff like that. So that's definitely part of the war, but it's not what makes war horrible or something. I don't really. They just show kind of the heroic and the good parts.
Yeah, and it almost feels sort of because we see when Cap rescues Bucky, he's obviously in the process of being experimented on by Red Skull, but you don't really see anything happening. And then, of course, we find out later in future movies, spoilers, I guess, that Bucky isn't really dead. He's been further experimented on by Hydra, and he ends up being brainwashed and becoming like the Manchurian candidate. No, the Winter Soldier. But yeah, it's interesting how they have this subplot where this is happening, but it almost feels because of course, like Hitler and his guys were doing this during World War II, like in a very real way, they were experimenting on people. and it was not good. If you ever want to just sort of be disappointed in humanity for the rest of your life, look up Dr. Mangala and all of his experiments. And yeah, so this, in a very real, brutal, awful way, this kind of shit was happening in World War II, but this version of it almost feels like a bit sanitized and removed from that. I mean, I know it's a comic book movie, so we're not going to get the nitty gritty,
Yeah. And it's also going to be for like kids. So I don't suppose you can show all that kind of horrible stuff.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you for listening once again this week. We can be followed on Instagram, Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. You can subscribe and rate us 5 stars on Spotify or any other podcast listening platform of your choice. Are you reading anything interesting this week?
I am not. I'm doing research again for our myth-making episode. It's eventually coming up. It's been planned, you guys. We're planning it.
Yes.
How about you?
I'm reading a book, or I guess I should say I'm listening to a book, because I too am doing research, but I like to go for walks and listen to audiobooks. So I'm listening to a book called And Then She Fell by an author named Alicia Elliott. And I believe she's a Mohawk woman. And I found out about it because one of my friends from university is like her brother-in-law or something. But it's this novel about this Indigenous woman who ends up marrying a non-Indigenous man, and she has to move off the reserve. And it's sort of her struggles with that. And it's been shortlisted for all these national awards. And I'm maybe about halfway through right now. And it's just really good. Like, I highly recommend it.
That sounds really good. I want to give one quick shout out to the one person, by the way, who answered our Spotify question about stuff we should watch in the future. I just want to say we've heard you. We will be watching Allied at some point. Thanks for submitting that.
It's on our list. We have them planned out weeks in advance. And next week, we are going to watch Tora Tora Tora, which we got interested in after we did our Pearl Harbor episode.
Yes, I'm excited. I look forward to it.
Yeah.
See you next week.
Bye.